is our panel on the return of interactive fiction. So now, instead of me just chiming in between talks, you're stuck with me as the moderator. So hi, I'm Kate Edwards. I'm the executive director of the Global Game Jam. I'm also the CEO of company Geogrify that does game culturalization. And I am proud to be a part of this panel and to introduce the panelists who are going to do most of the talking. So we have Gadney from Charisma.ai, Karoliina Korppo from 10th Muse, Shib Hussain from unrd, and then finally Geoff van den Ouden from Total Mayhem Games. So please welcome the panelists.
Hi everyone.
And hi everybody. Hi. So great. I'm glad to have you all here. So yeah, let's just start off. So I mean, we're talking about interactive fiction, which I think for some people might, that phrase interactive fiction kind of brings back memories, at least for those of us who are old enough, ancient memories of Zork and Infidel and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and all these fun text-based games that we did way back when. But of course, it's not limited to that at all. I mean, interactive fiction today has, become pretty much everything we know about games, and is intertwined throughout all kinds of different game types today. So, so what we're going to start off with is, let's just kind of address a fundamental question. So, I know that, like, when I've often given lectures, that I've asserted that every game has some form of narrative. There's something in there. Even something like Angry Birds does have a narrative that's built into that game. So do you think that every game actually has a story to tell, or does all it need is just a good set of game mechanics? So if the game plays good, it really doesn't matter if it has a story.
Well, maybe I could go first if it's fine. So what I work with most when I work with games is actually sandbox simulation, which is kind of an interesting genre in the storytelling sense, because it rarely has a story written into the game, but it's an emergent story, so that it happens when the user is there. I personally really enjoy like games that have a strong narrative element, like I enjoy books and movies, but there is something really unique in games, in a sense that if you just give mechanics to the player, they will make up a story in their mind anyway.
I do believe that, it's really strong to, if you find a balance as a game maker between what you're doing with the narrative and what you're doing gameplay wise, it has to precisely fit the game that you're making. So when people have no clue what the game is about, you forgot the narrative. If they're watching cutscene after cutscene after cutscene and they're like, come on, just give me the game, then you did it too much. And finding that exact balance, every game has a story, has a narrative, but finding the exact balance, that's key to what you're doing with the game.
Yeah, I think there's another interesting thing, that the games industry is so broad now that to try and make a generalization is almost impossible. It's almost like saying, sort of, what is what is an ideal story for a movie? What's an ideal story for a book? Can you get a story into a game? It's the breadth is now so broad that it's difficult to generalize. I mean, again, I tend to enjoy a good narrative in a game. I enjoy that. That's why we do what we do. But I find, as Geoff said, that interplay, that balance is, and making it right and making it integrated so that the player is having a seamless experience. That's the art,
Yeah, I think I agree with what everyone's saying. I think the only thing I was going to add, I think it's largely context driven as well, right? So to Guy's point, there's so many games now. If I'm playing a hyper casual game while waiting for the bus, for example, I'm not that interested in narrative. I'm more interested in the mechanic. But if I'm sitting down to play something on console, then yeah, narrative is something that keeps me coming back and drives the experience forward. So I think context is definitely one of the things to consider in terms of what and where your player is going to be when they're experiencing what you make.
That's great. Well, given that interactive fiction was responsible for drawing a lot of people into games like back in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of that was, of course, because the graphics capabilities back then pretty much sucked. And so, we basically had to focus on doing text-based narrative because that was really kind of the medium at the time. But then you fast forward to now, and we're seeing quite a resurgence in interest in player bases, in the fictional part, in having good story, good plots, and so on. And so do you think, what do you think are some of the factors driving that interest, where it's, we kind of went through this period of where story really, really mattered, was core to the gameplay. Then we kind of went through a lot of more into like, I guess, arcade style stuff where it's like, it's about the game mechanic and much less about the narrative. And now we've kind of shifted back, it seems, to a certain degree. So what do you think is a part of that?
Well, I'll just chime in. I mean, I think game design is really hard. It's an art, and it's challenging to do. Writing a good story is really hard. Trying to do both at the same time is really, really hard. And I think in some ways, we need to cut ourselves some slack. That a lot of ways that, you look at the timeline, Kate, that you're putting there, we're a really young industry, and to evolve and mature how to tell our stories in this way does take time. It takes time to get, to work out what we can do with the tool sets that we have. So I think there is always, we are genetically programmed as humans to enjoy stories. That's just the way we always are. And so it's natural that we should warm to a good story when it's there. The flip side is that we turn off when there's a bad story. So I think what we're seeing is this really beautiful maturation of the industry that can now handle both of them together, and the rules are starting to evolve, where we are no longer doing the traditional technique of a new medium where it just does what the old medium did, but puts it into whatever the new form is. We're now really starting to play with the bit that interests me more than anything, is how do you get the emotions out there? So it's not a narrative that is and then they went forward, and then they went forward again, and then they went forward again. It's something that properly makes you laugh, makes you cry, and hooks you into the story. And so I think we're sort of hitting our teenage years,
I think building on what Guy said, I think definitely what we see, and might apply across platforms, but I think another one is just the emergence of more people who are playing games who wouldn't consider themselves to be gamers. So definitely on mobile, interactive fiction, a large portion of that audience is female. Like certainly some people on Red, like 85% of our audience is female. And they wouldn't consider themselves gamers, but they love a narrative story. And that's something that's working well. So I think new audiences coming into gaming as well will help to drive those behaviors as well, and develop new ways to tell stories that they might be normally finding on TV, that they now expect games to deliver in a sense as well.
Yeah, I'd also kind of add to that what we are doing at 10th Muse is also that we're making, it's technically displaying, it is a game, but we're not calling it a game because like you said, Shib, this audience doesn't consider themselves as gamers. They might not buy a game because they're not like, well, I don't play. They want to experience something else. And interactive fiction is kind of in between of gaming and entertainment. So it might kind of be the gateway to playing something also in the future, but also it's not scary for this audience. They understand it when we tell them like, this is the story. You get to decide things like who do you want to marry? Does the main character go with the blonde vampire or the dark-haired one? So they're not even like thinking about, is this a game or not? They're just like, well, I want the blonde one, and then they click it, and that's that.
I also believe that times are changing, and you see that consumers' behavior change now that we have Netflix and streaming services that gives us series, not so much as films, but series. These are much more popular than they were ever before. People are used to have a narrative with what they want to spend their time in. They want to shut shut down from the real world and emerge in this world that they know and have a story leading them through that. So I think that that's also a factor of this time, that consumers invest more in stories, invest more in series and characters, and they also find that in computer games. And just what Caroline said, we can deliver interactive stories, so you can decide things, and that is something that you can't easily do within Netflix or anything. So that's something that games can add to that.
So, I mean, so based on your answers, I mean, would you agree then that basically, when you employ a story or employ some kind of narrative, that definitely helps immersion. It helps the player immersion into the experience, the overall experience, not just the story, obviously, but also the gameplay itself. So would you agree with that? I mean, basically, if kind of going back to what Guy said as well, as human beings, we respond really well to stories. So basically, is it as simple as like, F equals MA in physics, or like, you just add story and players, it'll enhance the player experience and they'll enjoy it more?
It's a bit like, I think it's a bit like adding a chili pepper. If you add the right amount of chili, it's going to make a really nice meal. But if you overload it or add it to ice cream, arguably that's not going to be the right solution. And picking up briefly on the Netflix thing, I mean, we just came off the back of an interactive video drama we produced for Sky, right, which was off the back of itself off Bandersnatch and all of those. And we've been looking a lot at the Kimmy Schmidt one that Netflix has just done as well. And there are elements in that which work, and there are elements in that which do not work. And that and it's to do with the way that the story is told and the layering of interactivity. So again, I think it goes back to what I was saying, which is that this is not easy, but we have to get it right, because we have a maxim at Charisma, which is one of our staff members said, which is you always want to be one step ahead of the player's imagination. You don't need to build an entire universe, but if you step behind that, if suddenly that wall breaks and the player, overtakes it, goes through the wall when they shouldn't, or gets hit in a cul-de-sac, then you've lost them. So it's a fine balance, I think, and it's still down to how you do it. It's not just, you can't just add it and expect for success.
Yeah, I'd maybe add on now that you mentioned Bandersnatch, the Netflix Black Mirror choose your own adventure type of a film. For me, that was a really interesting experience in a way that, because usually when I watch TV, I'm the passive person just watching. But with Bandersnatch, bringing me to be part of the story when I was actually a character in it, like making the choices. And it actually made me feel bad that I made bad choices for the main character. So it like never has this happened in any kind of TV entertainment before. While as in games, I know myself. Like if in Sims I want to get rid of one of the kids, I feel so bad afterwards. So it's really it's making the experience way more intense in some ways. I'm not yet sure like how can that be measured and what it actually is, but it really makes a big difference.
I was going to add to that. I guess how we think of it as well is almost thinking of as storytelling as like the ultimate game loop, right? So if you design it right, it's going to keep people coming back, and because it's a really long loop, if you've done it really well, people will want to get all the way through to the end. And I think that's the beauty that we have this something like Netflix, where you can't really iterate a movie live, whereas with games, we have so much data now, we can A/B test things, and you can literally see event by event when people drop out and maybe change your story and optimize it. So I think there's something interesting in thinking of storytelling as a game loop as well. That becomes really powerful when you apply it to all the technologies that we have available.
I think that's very interesting what you say, Shib, because one of the things, I see a lot of games still not really getting how they could use narrative for the benefit or for immersion. And then you see that, part 2 or part 3 of a game is kind of like the same. And it's not really bad if you have a strong game mechanic and use it over and over and over again, but you can have players come back for the story. You can then have come back for exactly, if you know from your data what was really great, what did people really like, and then make sure that you have a story to draw them back in. Do exactly the same as you did, and just add a few things that they liked and bring it more and more. And a lot of games don't really get how to catch the player on a story base and make sure that that is the reason why they come back.
Well, to build on your point, Geoff, that you just made, about essentially how do you measure then what players would exactly want when it comes to like narrative versus the game mechanics or game design, especially if development time is really limited. I mean, if you know your audience well, you can assume what they might enjoy, but do you think players today would prefer more gameplay over narrative, or what that might be? But more importantly is, how do you measure that? How do you go about determining that?
Well, if I look at how we do that in Mayhem games, we have a certain focus group with us. It's like a couple of hundred people, and we give them various different types of puzzles, different type of narrative, and then we really test with how they react to it. So it's part of the survey is not really that important. We want to see their face. We want to see how they react, what the emotion is. Are they really frustrated or angry? Because sometimes people say that they didn't like a part, but just like Caroline said, sometimes you have a really emotional roller coaster, and you need to make a choice which is, really serious, and you're like really emotional about it. I don't want to kill that person, or I don't want to do that. And they feel like they don't like it, but it's actually one of the best parts in the game, or best part you can do with your product. So just not only ask in a survey, but really, put on a camera, just watch how they experience your product, and then say, okay, this works. They say they hate it, but they love it. I see it.
Would others agree with that? I mean, do you all do similar methods in terms of gauging, doing user research and gauging their feedback?
Well, actually, what we are doing is we're basically cutting out the whole gameplay part in a sense. So we actually do interactive fiction, like really like text-based. So kind of like the choose your own adventure books. So we're building a tool for the authors to use, so that it's basically just really simple, so that they can write text. And if they want to do a choice, we give them basically boxes, like put the text in the box that you want to appear on the button. So, and this for the authors, this is super interesting, and also for us, because we can track how like the speed of reading, because we're actually tracking the words, counting the words that the users are scrolling past, and then seeing like what choices they make. So for us, because we have taken out the whole element of the kind of gameplay and made it all about the story, we're getting really interesting data, both for the writers, because they are so used to just like releasing a novel, then seeing if it sells. If it doesn't, it doesn't. If it does, it does. But like they don't know what works, what doesn't. And we are like, well, try this platform, and then if they all stop on page 10. So that's one way. We're bringing the game type data to the actual authors who are used to doing this in a different setting, and they find even the like lowest amount of data really interesting, because they haven't had anything before.
We do we do it in a slightly different way, which is quite fun in that for us, it's all about dialogue, and actually the story, the way it's written, is all through dialogue. So imagine that might be in comic book form, or interactive graphic novel. Imagine that, and you've got a format then that is 99% dialogue. And in fact, the way we've started with the Charisma app, that there was to license these 50-page long graphic novels and then adapt them, because the medium fits. That's another story. But what we can see then is because it's dialogue, we can see anonymized, but we can see exactly how people are responding because we can see what they're saying. So if a character says something and then the player is saying something, we can see what that sentence is. So there's the data, which is sort of, I guess, empirical data of how many people are going through certain branches and paths and what you'd expect. But then it's down to that granular level of are they saying, are they interacting? It's how as well as what. And from that, actually, we'll do, when we first launch a new title, we may do an update a day, an update every other day. The players don't see anything because it's all on the Charisma back end and it just goes up live. But we're looking at that data, seeing how people are responding. And it becomes a, not quite real time, but incredibly responsive way of updating. And then, as we can do in this medium, that refresh rate then slows down after a week or two. As we're starting to cater for all the different scenarios. So it's fun. It's a fun way to look at how people are interacting with the story, because you can really see how they're feeling.
No, that's fantastic. So yeah, in terms of building out a story and adding some kind of narrative to a game, is there a major difference between creating a plot for a single player game versus multiplayer? Is it essentially the same challenge, or what would be the difference if there is?
If I look at the game that we're making co-op games, cooperative. If we would think of a single player way we would do the game, then probably our player would be the hero, and we would make a incredible plot that he had to save or save the world or whatever. And now we make a co-op game, and because it's about two people, we think about, this story has to be about just those two, not about the world. The world is facilitating and is creating a setting and is something that is a mechanic in the story, but we want to make just a story about these two and not really care so much about the rest of the world. They don't have to save the world. They just maybe have to save each other or find each other or whatever. So I think that if you look at players and connecting them together, it's a different thing, because you'll have to think about story and how to connect these people together and how make sure that everyone has a place in the world, and it's really necessary to see the other player. And when you create a single player game, then probably you're the main guy, you're really important, and then the world has to revolve around you.
I also think, so how we're thinking about it as well is just adding a lot more social layers. So our stories are linear stories, and there's no choices. You just follow them along. So everyone has the same story effectively. But if you join on the same day as someone else, you can talk to them, you can interact with them. So for us, it's about how do we facilitate the sharing of those emotions that you feel as the story progresses. So it can be as simple as talking to people and making friends with them, all the way through to sharing emojis or sharing specific parts of the story. So I think increasingly social is going to become a bigger and bigger part. And that's either with your direct friends or just anyone else who might be experiencing that game or experience at the same time as you.
I was trying to think back, Kate, when, so in the late 90s, I produced a massively multiplayer online role-playing game called Diaspora, which was like a sort of online version of Elite. And I was writing a lot of missions for those. And it is, and I think Geoff was sort of alluding to this, structurally, it's very different, because you have to anticipate that that moment in the story takes place not only for a single player at a moment in time, but for effectively infinite number of players at any moment in time. And the story still needs to make sense given that set of parameters. So what we tended, it was not, again, it was not easy, but what we tended to do was rely on a lot of dynamic data coming back from where players were. So you're feeding into a spine of the structure, like contextual moments that make sense, if that makes sense. So there would be a mission, but the details of the mission would be dynamically drawn on from other areas of the game. And it had to be that way because because otherwise you were going to get, part of the, I think the other thing about that's very different from a regular story, in whatever definition that is, in a game story, is that the game story is designed to be replayed. And you can argue, and my kids who read Harry Potter 20 times will argue against this, but the replayability in a book sort of, you can read it again, but you'd expect the same thing to happen again. Whereas in a game, when you replay it, you sort of expect something different to happen because you're improving and you're learning on it. And I think it's a structural difference in the way that those stories are created, and it's sort of down to the DNA. You've got to go down to the core of the story again.
Great. Okay, well, let's move on. So we do have a couple questions building up, so we're going to get to those in just a moment. And just a reminder to folks watching, if you have any questions to this great panel, please put them in the Q&A, because we are about to get to those very soon. So just another point here is as the game market is getting more and more competitive, as we all know very well, especially when it comes to user acquisition and retention, do you think, especially when it comes to the more classic form of interactive media, or excuse me, interactive fiction, what do you think about adding additional things like voice input and video clips and other kinds of things that we're trying to sort of break the barrier a bit with the player? So it's not just about reading, it's not just about clicking. There's more capabilities that we're able to do now, especially as AI and other things get more advanced. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are on, adding these additional modes that we can engage the players.
I can start if you want.
I think you're the right person to answer.
I was going to say, so with our app, it's like a lost phone games effectively. So you have characters' phones. So we've gone really broad with it, where we've tested everything from a 50-hour live feed that you can tune into anytime, through to launching a podcast, through to characters having social media profiles that you can visit, through to voice notes. And I think the key thing that we found is actually the big benefit of having these is twofold. One, as we've talked about, if characters if users are into the story, it just creates such better retention, being able to interact with those mechanics. So being able to watch a video or listen to a podcast keeps you coming back and engage with the story more. And then secondly, I think if you do it really well, there's this surprise and delight element as well. So we get a large amount of traffic through people tagging their friends on characters' Instagram profiles. So they're so surprised that a fictional character has a real Instagram profile that they'll share that as opposed to the app, which then drives downloads. So I think if you do it smartly, those little tactics can actually help reduce CPIs as well in a smart way. That's what we've certainly found.
Yeah, quite recently I've been involved with some VR productions, and that's something that feels totally new as a game developer, because you usually feel that you can take the camera and show that, and this is what you're going to see and this is what you're going to hear. But in VR, especially when you do free roaming VR with multiple people in the same world, it's like you cannot direct anything. I mean, they look everywhere and they miss exactly the story that you're trying to tell. And that kind of opened my eyes in how you can tell a story without telling the story. What can you do in the world? What can you do? What's going on during the gameplay? And telling a lot of story without people really feeling it as a character talking to you, or really having to read something or having to actually pick something up. And along the way, you can, sometimes dynamically make sure that they find something, or that they hear something, or that they notice something. And that's something that I really noticed when you're making VR. You cannot grab the player and force them to see something. So you need to do it in a natural way.
For us, it's all about voice. It's key. It's voice in, voice out. So our entire gameplay revolves around, and you mentioned AI, around natural language processing. That's our interface, is the natural language. And if you, the Bulletproof project we did for Sky, bulletproof.sky.com, which is still up there, you're sitting down, sat opposite someone, and it is a video character who's like a serial killer, and you're talking. You know, you're talking to him, and he talks back. And you know, we took the actor after we did the shoot, we took him out into the sound engineer's car and padded up the car and, you know, recorded his voice and then fed that into a Resemble AI system that then trained a new programmatic voice. So, you know, we can't have a serial killer talking like Siri, it just wouldn't work. You know, so we got this guy and captured his voice and then tweaked it. It's a fine art to do it. And then that's what speaks back to you, is the voice of a serial killer. And I think it's, you know, I do think it's a way, it's the way forward for us, you know, and there's no right way, wrong way. But our view is that we want to place the player or the reader inside the story. And that positioning is key. From a writer's perspective, it's very difficult. But, you know, you want to get them inside. And voice for us is, and AI is vital in the way that we tell the stories.
Excellent. Well, if for the sake of time, if you don't mind, we're going to shift to the Q&A. We've got a couple of great questions here to start with. And you'd mentioned Siri, so I will start with this question where someone was asking, where do the panelists stand on audio games? Do Alexa and Siri represent an opportunity for interactive fiction to come back to the mainstream?
Well, I checked out a panel on these games at the last GDC that was in San Francisco, and to me there was a really interesting audience for these in actually kids. So maybe not the adults who want to spend so much time, or there must be adult audience too, but for kids it was really natural, so that when they like listen to the story, it is natural for them to feel that it should be interactive, going like, no, don't go there and do the other thing. So I think that might really catch on. It was super interesting.
I mean, my view on it, just briefly, is you know, Alexa is a black cylinder, Siri is a mobile, and you know, and in essence, they are built to be search engines or very quick retail experiences, you know, to do. So our view always is that those, whether it's Siri or Alexa or any other sort of speech thing, it's about getting you in and out as fast as possible. Whereas actually what we want is, we want people to, all of us around here, is we want people to have the conversation and stay in the story for as long as possible. That's our success. So I think with an Alexa, because you're limited to that, you know, that black cylinder or you know, thing is a bit of a challenge, and I think they're quite limited in the technology. But the fact that, you know, kids are starting to use it, great. You know, let's you know, we can broaden it out from there. I've seen some really good, by the way, nothing to do with that, I've seen some really interesting experiments in like first-person shooter voice interfaces, because you have to be microsecond perfect, and it's and they work, and it's you know, it's exciting to see how that's going to come on. It's different about storytelling, but it's an aside.
Well, you also have the game, I guess it was from Ubisoft, Bridge Crew, based on Star Trek, and they're using IBM Watson. And then you have this crew around you. You're in VR. You have this crew around you, and you can give orders, you know, half impulse, you know, 30 degrees that way. And I must say that the first time I played that, I expected it to be sucky, but it was really good. And it also then feel really natural, not like you're playing a game. You're just playing a game with others. And I can imagine that if you use something like Siri or Alexa, like all the time, it could be, you know, really just a discussion partner. And why not use fiction instead of, you know, everyday things?
The last thing I was going to add, which I don't know if anyone's done, I was just thinking about. I think with audio again, context is really important. So I could totally imagine, like, if you were on a long car journey and your car was Siri enabled, like creating games in that scenario, would be cool. But yeah, I think it definitely depends on like what the context is. But yeah, I think with kids or in car with kids or with friends could be really cool.
Yeah, and at least I know there's a Swedish company called Earplay, that is trying to, or their goal is to make these like audio choose your own adventure type of things. It really looks interesting too. So I'm watching them closely.
Great. Another question we have is, it so often happens that adding narratives, nicely done cutscenes, animations, etc., take much more effort and cost than to build the level that comes after it. Considering that players mostly like to spend their time actually playing the game, do you think this massive overhead still makes sense?
Well, maybe. Well, the reason why I started doing the project that I'm on now was really that when I was looking at like how game writing is done, and I love it. I love game writing. I've done it, and it's really the immersion is such a different level than in books, that it's super interesting. But it was like, so often did I run into the issue like, no, we can't do this because it's too expensive. We can't buy the animations, or like, and so kind of this was the whole thought behind, like, could we maybe cut out the animations and the visuals and all of this and just do the interactive writing part that I found super interesting. So that's at least one way to do it. But of course that doesn't have the gameplay that the person asking the question was wanting. So what do the other people think?
What we usually do is we make what we call an emotional roller coaster. So we determine, the whole game and how your emotion is going to be through the whole game. And then we noticed through tests that, if we make something very hard, but we reward you with the cutscene where you finally find your friend or you get that item that you were looking for, that makes the whole gameplay you did 1.5 hours before valuable. That's why you do it. That's the cream of the cake. That is the reward that you're looking for. So for us, we sometimes need to have that, because else the gameplay is just another puzzle, just another way to come out. And this is something people actually strive for and want to play the game just to get that 30 seconds of reward. So if I need to be honest, I think that a lot of the gameplay we have wouldn't be really that interesting if there wasn't a reward for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like when I did, I analyzed a lot of the storytelling games, and what it looks like basically is that there is the initial setup, like this is who you are, this is where you are, like usually. Then it's often said like, well, this is what you should be doing, and this is the problem, and then there has to be something before the problem is solved, and that's the gameplay. Like for Dragon Age Origins, you have to go through the different dungeons, and only then can you go to the end battle. And it wouldn't make sense in any other way. So there has to be the journey to the actual end resolution. And it really doesn't even matter so much like what is being done, especially if it's enjoyable, if it's nice playing, it works, it's a decent game to play. It in a narrative, it needs something in between.
And then maybe it's the narrative is the journey, but how, back to sort of what Shib was saying about context, you write it slightly differently for every story, because every story is going to be slightly different and every medium is going to be slightly different, and that makes sense to do it in that way. Otherwise, yeah, you get into cutscenes, which is, if there's a skip button at the bottom of a cutscene, you know it's not really meant to be there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's see. We do have one last question as we wrap up here. So do you think that nonverbal narrative is better for localizing games? Are images and visuals the best way to communicate a story universally?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's definitely easier. I think because as soon as you've got like with us, we have a lot of text and video and photos, and yeah, it's very story driven. And I think the challenge with story is, again, it's about context and about cultural context. is really important as well. So I think those are some of, we have a story where a girl goes missing after a night out. That wouldn't really fly in the Middle East because that culture doesn't really exist of going out and drinking. So yeah, I think it is definitely more challenging. So I guess it depends on the experience that you're aiming to build, right?
Yeah, it's and it's interesting. The cultural piece I go with totally. You know, we were looking at whether or not to put emojis into the system, and you think, oh well, you know, that's surely the same around the world, and it's totally not. I mean, it's dialectized within countries. So you know, the ways, even in answer to the question, you know, those images may not resonate across different countries. So I think there is no silver bullet. There's no right or wrong. It is but as long as one's thinking about it, then you're sort of halfway there and you're sensitive to it.
Yeah, and I kind of like, well, we do text mainly, so localization for us means actually localizing the text. And to me, it feels like maybe the really like fine meanings of text are really difficult to convey in like images or sounds or this way. So the kind of general feeling maybe that's like Guy said, that's really cultural specific. So we can't even do the same kind of like it's black, so this is sad type of thing, because then we go to Japan and it's like that's black is not sad. So really like then I don't know, text is kind of, localizing text is kind of the safest way.
And I would, or go ahead.
Well, you know, it's also, what really is difficult is you need a translator that actually gets what you're trying to say and why you're trying to say it. So sometimes we get the translation and then I find the native speaker in that language and I say, okay, you know, go through these texts and tell me what the story is about, or tell me what we're trying to say. And when it's the first draft of a translation, usually there's always something missing. So don't think that if you have a really good translator and he translates it perfectly, that he really gets the essence. Make sure that you find a few native speakers in every language that you publish in and ask them, what is the emotion? What do you feel? Why do you think we're saying this? And then you can maybe find better words to do so. Be really, really specific with translations.
And yes, and with that, and I'll just add my footnote as a geographer who does culturalization work in the game industry, which I'm speaking about at 5 p.m. on Friday during this very conference. Yeah, it's a super complicated topic. I mean, even doing non-visual, or excuse me, non-lingual, you know, non-text based can be really, really tricky. Just like Guy was mentioning, I mean, icon design, all of that kind of stuff, color usage, it all has to be adapted to some degree or another. So it basically, there's no easy way out is the way I would put it. So with that though, we have run out of time. And so I'd like to thank the panelists for the excellent discussion. This was fascinating. And also thank you all the attendees for coming today and staying with us. I think several of you stayed with us the entire Game Makers Insight track. So that's a wrap.